Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old Fourth Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
Hello. Been on the road the last couple of days, and so I am, a little exhausted, a little road exhausted. Also, yesterday, doing a walkthrough for a new home. Clients of mine who are purchasing a brand new home in coastal Georgia, and every wall in this house was white. The ceilings were white, the walls were white, every wall white. And if you've ever bought a new house, one of the things you'll learn that you do is you go through every room in the house with a roll of blue tape, painter's tape, and you put a little piece of blue tape next to all the imperfections. My clients and I got there about an hour or so before the building supervisor did. And we did our blue tape thing. We walked around and we blue taped everything that we thought was an imperfection. And then the builder came in, the supervisor. And Scott's about 5'2", but packs a lot of punch. And went through with his roll of blue tape and out blue taped us by, a 4-1 margin. We thought we had found all the imperfections. That guy came through. It looks like a confetti party in still motion after he went through that entire house. So between driving the interstates in gray and foggy conditions and being white blind from all the walls, I'm a little exhausted, like between the eyes and the brain, a little exhausted. But nonetheless, here we are, ready to go, taking on the day. One of the things I did on the drive back last night was catch up on some podcasting that I hadn't listened to in a while. And I had bookmarked one in particular. I don't tend to listen to Bill Maher's podcast. It's called Club Random. And in Club Random, he has like this man cave in his house where he invites someone to be his guest each week. And he'll either partake of the weed. We all know Bill Maher loves to partake. Or in the case of Jane Fonda, who doesn't, he decided, all right, so we'll have a few cocktails. And they did, and they conversed. And this went on for, it had to be more than an hour and a half because it was a long stretch of my drive back from Savannah last night. Bill Maher has made a career off of political commentary wrapped in comedy, satire. And Jane Fonda, obviously well known for her progressive political views, made for, I believe, an interesting contrast from Bill Maher because she is unaffected by the same sorts of things that I believe have somewhat manipulated Bill Maher's mindset. And that's why I bookmarked that particular podcast episode to listen to. I used to be a huge Bill Maher fan. I would watch Real Time every Friday it came out on HBO at the time, HBO Max eventually, Max now. And then I think CNN even re-airs it on Saturdays now, so I don't have to pay for Max if I do want to. But I don't catch it very often. My ex-husband even did a nice thing once. Okay, so occasionally he did nice things. He did a nice thing once. He isn't a big Bill Maher guy either. But we were living in South Carolina at the time, and he had gotten tickets when Bill Maher was coming to Columbia and sort of surprised me. And I'm trying to remember how it was he had me dressed for an occasion like that to go somewhere else in my mind, and ta-da, we're going to this instead. I don't remember, but that was a nice thing. We went and we saw it. It was funny. But over the last few years, I feel like Bill Maher has sort of wandered off the reservation a little bit, ideologically speaking, and has sort of turned his ire inward towards progressives. Wokeness has been a big issue with him. I believe he has been somewhat manipulated in some ways, not unlike the way he would mock MAGA culture for being manipulated as well. In a less severe way than hundreds of thousands, millions of Americans have fallen victim over the last 4, 5, 6 decades or so to talk radio. Ironically, I bring up religion because he is the man behind the documentary film Religulous, and Fox News, et cetera, and so on. Now, Bill Maher's not a Fox News guy, obviously. He's not a talk radio guy, obviously. But because of what he does for a living, his craft being a satirical political commentator / comedian, he does look for the outlandish, and he loves to use the low-hanging fruit, making fun of the outlandish, and I think it's actually affected his political ideology. And Jane Fonda obviously is a way more go with the flow, hey, I trust people, let people be what they want to be kind of person, and has been for decades, obviously. And when the two got to sit down, have a few cocktails, and speak openly, Jane Fonda really didn't hold back.
I've been saying this on my show. There is two parts of the Trump coalition. There's about a third of this country who always loved the hard right wing.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Birch Society. We're old enough to remember the John Birch Society.
I had family members who were John Birch.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And these were people who were happy when Kennedy got assassinated. They became the birthers. They became the Tea Party. There's about a third of this country that's very hard right.
Mm-hmm.
Of course they love Trump. When he left office, he had an approval rating of 34%. So he really only had those people.
Mm-hmm.
Why is he now tied? Because the other part of the coalition are people who, they don't really like him that much.
Mm-mm.
They just think the far left
Here it comes.
has gone so nutty on so many issues.
That's what they're being told.
That's
Right.
what they,
By people like you.
because it's true. You think the far left does nothing crazy?
Oh, I'm sure they do.
Oh, well then,
But I don't know. Who is the far left? What do you mean when you say far left?
I mean, I could give you a million
Yeah,
examples.
well, give me one.
Yeah.
Okay, the NAACP.
You think
Right.
the NAACP is far
Could I
left?
finish my sentence?
Yes.
You asked me for an example.
Yeah.
The NAACP last year issued a travel advisory. That's like the State Department does to go to, I'm sure when you went to Vietnam, they were advising you not to. There's a war on
I
it.
didn't talk to them. I don't have no
I know, but a travel advisory.
Yeah.
Today we have them for very dangerous countries.
Yeah.
Don't go to North Korea. Don't go to Iran.
Yeah.
You know where they issued a travel advisory for black people not to go?
Yeah.
Florida.
Here's the problem. If Bill Maher, who is a liberal, had decided to dive into the rationale behind that, he'd have learned that it wasn't so much about telling black people not to travel to Florida or to live in Florida, move to Florida, but to actually galvanize black Floridian voters against the Republican governor, Ron DeSantis, who Bill Maher has spent plenty of time mocking, ridiculing, and tossing barbs at. This from NBC News, Curtis Bunn, reporting that the NAACP's travel advisory for black people considering a visit or move to Florida has less to do with potential travelers and more to do with rallying the black residents of the state to counter Republican-led policies. Members of the civil rights organization told NBC News. Leon W. Russell, the chairman of the NAACP's National Board of Directors, who lives in Tampa, said the travel advisory was an informational and strategic tactic to galvanize black voters, especially black men, against Governor Ron DeSantis. Let me be clear, he says, we're not calling for a boycott or a travel ban. We're saying to black people who come to the state or who are thinking about coming to the state that you need to be aware of what's going on here, and you need to think about how you are going to be impacted by this hate and cruelty that is being generated. You need to consider whether or not you're going to be safe. The advisory reads, Florida is openly hostile towards African Americans, people of color, and LGBTQ plus individuals. Would Bill Maher like to counter that? Before traveling to Florida, please consider that the state of Florida devalues and marginalizes the contributions of and the challenges faced by African Americans and other communities of color. Bill Maher wouldn't argue that in a million years. But he, like many others who just skim the headlines, didn't dive any further into the story and is affected by it, when he actually wouldn't disagree at all with the rationale behind the travel advisory that the NAACP put out. Instead, he just goes, well, that's just absolute batshit, and reacts to it and pushes himself further from being aligned with what they actually are saying that he actually does agree with.
Every day there's stories like that that just makes people roll their eyes and go, are you people nuts? Even if they don't matter that much, I don't think one person listened to this and thought, I can't go to Florida. But they just suggest something to the average person, which I completely understand, which is, wow, do you people ever find anything that's ridiculous?
What's crazy is he hosts a show that he airs Friday nights on HBO Max, where he could dive into that story a little deeper and instead chose to just react to the headline.
You really think men can get pregnant? You know, that kind of stuff. And I understand that a trans woman can get pregnant. That's different than a man getting pregnant. And the way they sort of insist on blurring that line is if that's some sort of reasonable social cause, as opposed to just being for having full rights, respect, and protection for trans people. We get that.
So I've never heard about men getting pregnant. I've never heard about this argument. It must be some part of what you call the far left that is so minuscule that I, who am...
No, Jane, it's not minuscule, and I'm sorry, you can't throw this back on us. I assume it's because you are locked into media that just never...
Or isn't at all.
Never wants anyone in their audience to know anything sketchy about the blue team.
And in actuality, what he's proving is he is just as much manipulated by the headline generators, the outrage machine that exists in right-wing media that he, likes to make fun of all the time, but yet he's also being manipulated by it himself. There's not a whole lot of Democratic politicians or policy on paper or on websites or campaign material that speaks to any of the stuff that he's talking about. And yet he believes that that's exactly what the Democratic Party believes. And so he is just as much manipulated by it as are the voters that he mocks that get manipulated by MAGA politicians and their media cohorts, the ones that he has spent a career making fun of. There's more of this exchange. In fact, I'm going to take a quick break and come back and we'll dive into it. And Jane Fonda, I'm so proud of her. 87 years old, man. She is his senior by about 17 years or so. And she doesn't miss a beat, even with the alcohol. Ron Show continues after this on America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn. So in listening to Club Random, I was also struck by how many things that Bill Maher shills for. Commercials. First 3 or 4 things you hear are commercials. He was touting blankets and socks. What else? There were several products that he was shilling for. I choose not to do that, for now anyway. But the reason I do that is because I want to stick to content. And I know I air on 2 online radio stations that they infuse their own commercials in, but let's try and keep this 45 minutes of substance. You can help, by the way, if you would like to do as several have done. Lee and Calvin, they make contributions to the Ron Show at ronshowatl.com/donate. Thank you so much for that. Jane Fonda was on a few weeks back, his Club Random podcast, and the two of them were sort of arguing about the wokeness of the Democratic Party. Again, not that you can find any evidence of that other than what Jane Fonda said Democratic politicians tend to do, which is just live and let live and respect differences and accept people for who they say that they are. Bill Maher, on the other hand, has been manipulated by the same right-wing media ecosystem by their being outraged by the purported outlandishness of transgenderism, the NAACP calling for a travel advisory for folks going to Florida, Black Lives Matter, et cetera, and so on. He's literally falling victim to the same sort of right-wing manipulation that he has spent decades mocking.
I should watch Fox News.
No,
I guess.
I don't watch Fox. That's too far.
Snarky.
But you don't have to. I'm not going to torture myself.
So here's where Jane Fonda reminds Bill Maher what being a liberal in this country is actually supposed to be about. And he seems to have lost his way on that.
I'm for the team that understands that everybody should have the same opportunities, that everybody should be able to attain a middle-class life.
That's right.
That
yes.
Yep.
That's not what we're talking about.
Child care should be. I mean, this isn't far left. And
no, that isn't. It's interesting. The Democratic politician, generally in this country, are not far left.
Then what the are you complaining about, dude?
They don't stand up to the crazy when they hear it. That's true. But they themselves, like after 2020, a big rallying cry was defund the police. You remember that?
Yeah, I was critical of that.
Okay. Okay, and so were most Democratic politicians. The Republicans
I
try.
know where it comes from, though. I mean, I understand where the
Exactly.
desire to
Yes.
do something about a police
yeah, thank
force
you.
that all too often is willing to shoot black people.
Speak to that.
But
Well-
defund the police, I knew was a very bad political slogan.
Slogan, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we could unpack there, but
Well, allow me then. Defund became sort of the hyperbolized caricaturization of a movement that called for taking money used for militarizing the police and instead using it to accentuate what police departments do when they're out serving and protecting. Sometimes you need mental health professionals going to a call instead of two armed goons who have spent, 12, 16 weeks tops training for these sort of scenarios so that the mental health professional can be there to deal with someone who is dealing with a mental health crisis. Or you have a domestic fight between two spouses, and you need someone who can be something of a relationship counselor to be there on hand to de-escalate the situation so things don't get out of hand instead of, again, two officers with weapons on their hips, if not drawn, who aren't capable of de-escalating the situation by professional training, unless the professional training that they've gotten is just experience while on the beat. But until they get that experience, aren't they something of a danger to that sort of situation? That's what Defund was all about, actually. Not actually just getting rid of police departments altogether or taking cops off the street, but helping the cops that are on the street have better tools and professionals within their ranks who are qualified to handle the situations that they're being called out to.
that certainly has been the history of this country, was police who were all too willing to shoot black people.
Okay, that part too, actually.
So defund the police, though, was not a good idea. And you know who mostly didn't think it was a good idea was black people, because they want police in their neighborhoods, probably more than we need them in ours.
No argument. Yeah.
So,
but here's the thing. They also wanted to deal with qualified immunity. They also wanted to make sure that police departments and police officers were trained in understanding marginalization, understanding implicit bias, et cetera, and so on. And that's the sort of push that the left also made that he pays no attention to because, again, he is manipulated by the same hyperbolic caricaturization and outrage-generating nonsense that comes from right-wing media.
but the Republicans tried to catch the Democrats with this, and they put this on, they brought it up in Congress.
Yeah.
And all the Democrats voted against it. The Democratic politicians were not for defunding the police. It's that radical fringe that has captured a lot of the media, academia, some of these cultural institutions that are not liberal anymore by my old school liberalism. The ACLU was all about free speech. They don't really believe in it anymore. They believe, in one of their chief people who is trans said, I will die on this hill of banning this book, which was a very reasonable book about a subject that's still debatable.
What was the subject of the book?
How we should treat kids who say they are trans,
Oh, yeah.
Which is one of those issues, I think, which is, there's a centrist position that's like, yes, of course, it's a real thing that we should deal with, but we are a country that does it in a way no other country does anymore.
How so?
Yes. How so?
Allowing no age limits.
Not true.
And do it by self-diagnosis of the child, and
not true.
Make it illegal in some places to tell the parent.
Also not true. There are some situations where a child is scared to come out to their parents, whether lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, where a school counselor or a teacher that they confide in has to weigh the pros and the cons, but there's no keeping secrets from parents when it comes to matters like this. And that's the sort of manipulation that Bill Maher falls susceptible to, no different than Donald Trump, who we mock, who was on the campaign trail telling people that they would have their kids go to school as Timmy and come home tomorrow after some sort of transgender surgery was happening on public school budgets. We can barely keep the lights on with public schools, and you think they've got money for transgender surgeries? That's outrageous. Bill Maher is no less susceptible to misinformation than Donald Trump and the same MAGA culture that he's been mocking for more than a decade, Republicans for more than 2-3 decades, and has made a healthy living off of all this time.
There are probably situations where the parents, maybe the child is being incested, or
that is why they do it, because.
But you know what I feel? I feel like you're taking a problem that exists. There is somewhere some pretty dismissible and far left thing, and you're making it a big issue, and I don't think it is.
This is the argument people say, and my answer to that is, I don't think you know. You're saying I don't know. I think you don't know how pervasive some of this stuff is.
He sounds a lot like Joe Rogan, right? Remember, Joe Rogan had to be corrected on his own podcast when he came in about an anecdote about a kid using a litter box because the kid identified it as a kitten. We'll pick up this conversation after the break. The Ron Show, America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn.
Broadcasting 5 days a week to make common sense common again. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
So if you're just listening in, thank you for doing so. You can hear the entire show in its entirety. Weekdays, 9 to 10 a.m., 5 to 6 p.m. on America One Radio. 11 to midnight at Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast once I post a podcast. And I admit I've been a little late the last couple of days because I've been on the road a lot, and so it'll either get posted late night or early in the morning. And the next day, and I apologize for that. I try and do it the same day if and when possible. But when you subscribe, you'll just get the notification that you've got a new episode, right? When you follow that podcast wherever you podcast. Speaking of podcasts, last night I'm driving back from Savannah. I got a long 3.5-hour drive, and so I decided I was going to catch up on some bookmarked podcast episodes that I hadn't had a chance to listen to. And one of the ones that I wanted to catch up on was an episode of Club Random, which is Bill Maher's podcast, where he just sits down. I think this week he was hanging out with Paul Reiser. I have no interest in listening to that whatsoever. Not a big Paul Reiser fan. Didn't watch Mad About You. Just not, it's not my thing. And in general, I've just sort of checked out. I've kind of gotten soured on what Bill Maher is serving, because I believe he's fallen susceptible to the same sort of manipulation that right-wing media and their outraged generation has been spouting for decades and trying to do the divide and conquer thing. I think Bill Maher has spent a lot of time the last couple of years, 3-4 years or so, pointing barbs at the party and the side of the ideological spectrum that he is very much more aligned with, if he just weren't so susceptible to falling victim to the same sort of outrage machine that he's mocked for decades. In some respects, I think he doesn't sound all that different than Joe Rogan, who, again, a progressive, pro-choice, pro-trans, pro-pot, pro-Palestine podcaster who also fell susceptible to right-wing outrage over left-wing so-called lunacy.
It was all made up. That's the admission from Joe Rogan, who spoke on his popular podcast about a school that supposedly offered litter boxes for students who call themselves furry. Now Rogan admits it didn't happen. It's a reminder for broadcasters to confirm a story before they share it, and for the rest of us to be skeptical of stuff that seems outlandish.
Joe Rogan spoke about the crazy rumor on his podcast.
My friend, his wife, is a school teacher. And she works at a school that had to install a litter box in the girls' room because there is a girl who's a furry.
15 days later, he acknowledged he shouldn't have said it.
The kitty litter boxes is a weird one.
It is weird. It's more like an urban legend.
I fed into that. I don't think they actually did it. It doesn't seem that there's any proof that they put a litter box in there.
But that's not stopping other influential people from spreading the fake story, like Donald Trump Jr.
Up in New England, they had litter boxes.
So did former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard.
The accommodations for this child who identifies as a cat in school.
If you don't know what furries are, it's where school children
comedic
dress up as animals, cats or dogs, during the school day.
Oh, my God.
They meow and they bark.
CNN's Jake Tapper reported on the nutty myth and was completely incredulous.
I mean, what? This is, needless to say, nonsense.
Right.
It's completely baseless, and Joe Rogan and Spotify pushed it to an audience of his millions of listeners.
Yep.
Kids.
Every single one of the school districts that were singled out have said those claims were untrue.
They are. As you can hear, we got that from Inside Edition. Thank you for that. Anyway, I digress. I kind of feel like Bill Maher, in some respects, sounds not unlike Joe Rogan. He was on a few weeks ago with Jane Fonda, 87 years old, and still, that lady's sharp as a tack. We've been so concerned about our 80-some-year-old president and the 80-some-year-old president-elect and their mental acuity. Jane Fonda is still sharp as a tack. And by the way, they're having cocktails while they're having this conversation. She's still sharp as a tack.
We want to have a world where the kids understand that it's okay to be whatever you are. Gay, trans, black, white. This is old school liberalism. It's another thing to sort of put out the idea so much that you might not be the default setting. You know, there is a default setting. That doesn't mean it's better. It's just a different.
No, I don't understand what you mean. When
male and female.
Mm-hmm. What's the default setting is?
That babies are born either male or female. But there is variations. That doesn't mean it's worse. And we respect it just as much.
Yeah.
But that's not what they do. That's not what a lot of the TikToks are about. They're not,
I know this because I've been around longer than you have. And what I have always noticed is that the beginning of any movement, people are very radical and very, I don't know what the right word is, but you know, and then it kind of like joins reality more. And I think that's...
Yeah, like I said, the Democratic politicians, I feel like by and large, they do live in reality. They're in it more for the right reasons. They're more likely to be policy wonks and actually know the details. Republicans, very few of them ever know any detail. That's just not where their mind goes. You know, Bush, Reagan, Trump, you know, you think of them and you don't think of them like really mastering the subject, like Obama, Hillary Clinton, you know, Bill Clinton. They were wonks, you know, and that's what you really need to be an effective governor of the country or the state. But like Clinton and Obama, which are our last two successful Democratic presidents, 2-term, both of them went much more toward the middle. That was their success. And I don't see anybody anymore going toward the middle. The Trump people, they just go toward being as big a dick as we can. We'll have a rally and let me just say awful things and call her a whore, you know, just disgusting.
And then they wander into a conversation on climate change, and Jane Fonda holds her own again.
Okay. We're facing a climate crisis.
Oh, that too.
And we, according to science, I believe in paying attention to the science, we don't have a lot of time to do something about it. There comes a point where the tipping points happen, and then there's nothing we can do. It's out of our control. And we don't have a lot of time between now and the tipping points, okay? Which is stop all new fossil fuel development, cut our emissions in half very quickly, and then gradually phase out. That would probably be considered, maybe even by you, as radical.
Well, it doesn't even matter because it's never going to happen. That's just not something humans are willing to do.
It's going to have to happen.
No,
or there's no future for us.
Well, first of all, that's not necessarily true. I've always been on your page. You know,
well, then how can you say that isn't necessarily true?
I'll get to it if you let me.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, the problem with tipping points, which I totally am on the page. There is a tipping point, and it could be tomorrow. We don't know. But the problem with that argument is that they have been saying it for a long time and made tipping point predictions that we've passed. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen, because I agree, it is going to happen. It's just common sense. You can't do what we're doing. We know how it changes the atmosphere. Most of the discussion in the last year has been about, there are like 4 or 5 new methods they've come to, you know, maybe AI had something to do with it, I don't know, but that are coming online, carbon capturing type of stuff.
Right. We can't depend on that.
we can't. We can't. My question always is, we tried, people should be better. And they're like, fuck you. And that's just Americans. What about the Chinese and the Indians who that's most of the planet. And for years, they didn't have cars and air conditioning because they were poor. But they've been lifted out of poverty by the hundreds of millions. And now they want cars and air conditioning. Mm-hmm. Are you going to tell them, rich white lady, sorry, we used up all the air. And now you can't have these things. They're going to go, fuck that. You guys enjoyed it, and we're going to have it now.
What we do is the simplest and the least expensive thing, which is we bring solar to them. The powers that be want to bring nuclear, which is a disastrous.
You made a movie about it.
Yeah, it's a terrible idea, and it certainly won't solve the climate crisis. It takes at least 10 to 20 years to build a reactor. No, we bring them inexpensive, locally controlled solar energy and electric cars. We haven't lived up to our promises of giving them money, and we need to give the Global South money so they can do these things. They don't have to go through the same.
Again, people are going to give. Even liberals, when they're polled about this, and even when they say, like, agreeing with us that this is a crisis, and then the next question is, and what would you pay in a year to address this crisis? And the answer is like $10 or maybe $100. Not close to the money we're talking about. I mean,
but we have to get in a government that will give the money that we're talking about.
Well, you have to vote.
We have to make sure that that part of the world that needs development like we've had, we have to offer them the new way of developing. So you don't have to go right through. It's like there are countries that left over feudalism. They don't have to go through fossil fuels to get to a sustainable energy source. We can,
but I mean, darling, this would have to be passed by Congress. We can't transfer trillions of dollars, especially to other nations, by fiat, unless we become a dictatorship,
That's why voting is so important. We have to elect people who understand, be they Republicans or Democrats, that we're in a crisis and we have to do everything we can. And we have to say, what?
I know, but I'm telling you, nobody in Congress is going to vote for that because they would have to answer to their constituents who would be saying, why are you saying that my taxes have to go up 60%
Let me tell you something.
India?
Listen.
That's just going to happen in America. You know that.
We, taxpayers, including poor people, out-of-work people all across this country, are giving $20 billion to the fossil fuel industry every year. Think what that money could do. $20 billion could go to Africa, South America, the places that want to develop and solve their problems. We're paying for that. The people that are killing us are getting our money to do it. So we stop the subsidies, and put it to helping the rest of the world. You know what I mean?
I'm not opposed to your plan. I'm just saying it's not a plan that will ever get passed. So why obsess about it?
Because we're dying.
Maybe what we should do.
Extremes are killing us?
I'm sorry to say it. I always resisted it. Is, yes, we might have to invent our way out of this. And it looks, I'm telling you, all the articles this year, not from right-wing sources, this is in the New York Times, are actually very promising. There's like 5 new, which kind of makes sense because we are getting, I mean, with AI especially,
just easier.
The amount of scientific questions that elude us is going to decrease exponentially. This is how I think that you and I might be sitting here in 100 years and having this 100th year anniversary of the first time you were on Club Random, because it's possible we could live forever. I certainly hope you do. But
I certainly hope I don't.
Really?
No.
Why? You're having a great time.
No, life.
No, I mean now.
Life only makes sense if there's a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Why? That's a story. That's not life.
I mean, if you really think about living forever, not tempting to me at all.
But you don't want to go tomorrow. So you think there's a day that's going to be like, oh, tomorrow is a good day?
I don't care. I'm not afraid of dying. I just want to be sure that when I die, I know that I've done everything I possibly could
That you did.
I am.
I mean, you.
You're so cynical. God.
Yeah.
Well, and you're so naive.
Pot calling kettle
You
black.
think so?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But I love you.
See.
This is where Club Random stop for a quick commercial break. I'm going to allow America One Radio and Progressive Voices via TuneIn to do the same. If you're listening via podcast, then good news. It's just a quick breath, and then I'm right back at it. All right, final few minutes of the Ron Show. Thank you for listening. And you're hearing me sort of review, I think, a 2-3-week-old podcast episode of Bill Maher's Club Random, where he sat down with Jane Fonda, super progressive Jane Fonda, who has always been super progressive for decades, and Bill Maher, who used to be, I think, sort of super progressive, and not unlike Joe Rogan, has sort of been manipulated by the outrage machine that exists on the right to point to what he believes is outrageous, outlandish postures, positions by progressives, to then mock them, and in that way, he's sort of contributing to the demise of the political side of the spectrum, the ideological spectrum of this country. And I don't know, maybe that's the game plan all along. Maybe another 4 years of Donald Trump actually extends his comedic success. I mean, don't get me wrong. We understand Trump provides a lot of fodder for comedians and will continue to do so for as long as he continues to live. That being said, what Bill Maher is doing as a satirist, as a political commentator, comedian / satirist, is exposing himself for being no different than the bourgeois when it comes to how we, the people, digest our political commentary and news from the biased media. He says it himself. Listen.
No, I think I'm very normal. I think I'm very normal, and I love when I grew up. You know, I think it was like a very normal time
for white people and straight people.
If you were white, yeah.
Yes, if you were white,
Bingo.
absolutely. Glad we said that.
So dismissive.
I mean, you know, I can't help that, nor could you, when we were born and how we were, you know.
Nobody's asking you to.
The color of our skins.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with race, I always feel, is like, you and I personally didn't do it, but our race did it.
And continues.
And we benefited from it.
And still do, yeah.
Go, Jane.
Yeah. But less than before. I feel one problem liberals have is they don't feel like they can acknowledge progress because it somehow makes them less good. They just have to always, there's more work to be done. And there always is more work to be done. We're humans on Earth. There always will be. But
it's pretty serious for people of color.
Thank you.
What is?
The ability to live a middle-class life, the ability to accumulate wealth, the ability to own a home. You know, they are prevented from doing those things by laws that remain in place, like redlining and mortgage issues and so forth.
That remain in place? Mm-hmm. Redlining?
Mortgage issues, they can't get the same loans and mortgages that we do, white people do.
It's not against the law?
They're still discriminated against. I don't know about the laws. It still happens. It's very hard for black people.
Well, okay, residential realtor here. Let me just step in. What she's speaking about is listed with like redlining and block busting. That sort of stuff is not much part of the home buying process anymore. What is still part of the home buying process, however, is your credit score. Your credit score is a big deal. And when you have familial and generational wealth from past home ownership, which is what African Americans don't have the benefit of, by and large, some do, most don't, is a margin for error. When you have medical debt that affects and impacts your credit score, you're going to have credit issues. When you have student loans affecting your credit score, and you need student loans when you don't have familial generational wealth in order to send your kids to college with. We know that student loans disproportionately benefit people of color, women of color in particular. This is not just a race issue, it's a gender issue. Student loans affect credit scores. Trust me when I tell you that I talk with folks all the time who want to buy their first home, and because of credit scores, they're unable to buy a home. And they didn't talk about this, but I will. Appraisals still show bias. There have been studies that show that appraisals come in lower for homes owned by African Americans. See, when you do get to the part where you get to buy a home, and then you are going to sell your home, appraisals come in lower if it's obvious that the home is owned by an African American person or family. And that's something that still exists, and we're trying to combat that sort of stuff. It's not empirical. It's not by law. It just still happens.
Racism still is with us.
Mm-hmm.
The question I think we're asking is it institutional?
In some respects, the answer is obviously yes, it still exists in the institution, and we have to root that out, right?
It's institutional in terms of wealth accumulation. It's very hard for people of color to accumulate wealth the way we can.
Definitely the biggest factor when you look at discrepancy is family wealth. It's crazy. Like the average net worth.
Mm-hmm.
This obviously is a legacy of our despicable history. For the longest time, Black folks couldn't own anything.
Do you consider it very radical?
But the question then is, how do you address that?
Well, you can start by not mocking people who are admitting that it exists, actually mocking those who oppose critical race theory, because that's the sort of stuff that would be getting taught in our school systems if we were allowed to teach it.
This one is not one that's on my radar. I didn't know that. I certainly was aware that, for different reasons, I thought Black folks sometimes did have a harder time just getting a mortgage, getting a loan. That's just individual racism that people have. These people just have stereotypes. But I feel like we passed the laws that you mean like this is not covered in any statute right up until 2024 that a mortgage company can do that?
It's the past wrongs that nobody's trying to undo. The talk of reparations. That's taboo. Can't bring up reparations because folks like Bill Maher, even on the left, would recoil in horror.
Home ownership is the beginning of wealth accumulation. It's something that everybody should be able to do.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem because there's so much accumulated from centuries of having a monopoly on it, white wealth. And parents tend to give their money when they die to their kids. Yeah. That's why we have so many Nepo babies. It's interesting, like girls in their 20s, they don't know a lot of celebrities. They all know you. They all idolize.
Because I've been arrested a lot.
You've been arrested.
And I've spoken my mind.
Yeah, you stayed relevant, and that's to get that generation to go from your own generation down to that generation. That's not something a lot of people can claim.
Maybe it's okay because I don't think in those terms very much. I just live my life. And it turns out that young people care about the same issues I do, and so they like that I'm willing to put myself on the line for them. I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, because their complaint usually about people our age is, what do you care? You're not going to be here after you wreck the planet.
Yeah.
So for someone like you to be willing to go to jail, which can't be fun.
If you're white and famous, going to jail is nothing. It doesn't mean anything.
Right.
I noticed during the 4 months that I was in D.C. getting arrested every Friday with Fire Drill Fridays, very few of our speakers of color joined me. And that's because jail means one thing to people like us and another thing if you're Black or Hispanic. And they said, no, thanks.
Right.
They spoke at the rallies, but they didn't want to engage in civil disobedience. It's different like in the South during the amazing, in the 50s and 60s when really brave Black kids sat at lunch counters and got beaten. But that was their issue, Climate isn't quite on a place where they're willing to get beaten up yet, I guess. But young people really care about climate, though. It's their future that we're squandering and destroying, and
again, we're talking about, I feel like a common goal, a common belief that it's really happening. But then, it is a reasonable debate, is it not? It's not cynical to argue about how do we get there. And I don't think it's like...
No, that's not cynical.
Okay. Well, neither is, I think, being practical, and being able to say, but this is never going to really happen. As much as it should happen and we want it to happen and we can keep agitating for it to happen, I just don't think people are going to give up the quality of being selfish.
Now, that's a cynical point of view. But I do think Bill Maher is no different than a lot of MAGA Trump supporters in that he, too, has been manipulated. And I think we heard a lot of that evidenced in the last few years and in some of this conversation with Jane Fonda. Anyway, I'll put that and everything else I discussed today in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Back tomorrow, 9 to 10 a.m., 5 to 6 p.m. on America One Radio, 11 to midnight at Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast. Have a great day.